they found when they analyzed the DNA, and they wrote this in this paper, it's fascinating. They said the Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral population, which was itself admixed with Africans prior to the beginning of the Jewish diaspora that occurred in the 8th century BC. And so what that's saying is, because you hear the skeptics say the Jews were never in Egypt, which means they were never in Africa, right? So where in the world did all this infusion of African DNA come from? This shows that the Hebrew people came out of Egypt with many other Africans that were grafted into the Israelite nation, and they repopulated with them to the point where African contributions to DNA are throughout the Jewish population today.
Now, I've heard a lot of lame arguments for trying to justify the Moses story of Egyptians, of Israelites being captives in Egypt. This has to be one of the worst, trying to make science corroborate their story when it absolutely does not. Because what this gentleman is not telling you is the fact that prior to the Merneptah Stele, which is around 1200 BCE, there is not one mentioning of an Israelite ever existing. Prior to that, no archaeological evidence of an Israelite. The Moses story was supposedly had happened in and around the 1500 BCE, so about 300 years prior. The problem with your entire story of saying that they had to have come out of Egypt if they were to have African DNA in them is nullified by the fact that prior to 1200 BCE, that entire area was a vassal state of Egypt, meaning Egypt controlled it all the way up to about the 2000s, or maybe even a little further, 2500 BCE. They controlled this area. So if Moses' story was a true story, Moses would have left Egypt just to come to more Egypt. But what we do know is that that area was controlled by Egypt. And with Egypt being a people of African ancestry, then it is understandable that those people that they were subjugating at that time frame would have had intermixtures of marriage and blood and so on and so forth. Now, an interesting aspect of it that you might want to think about is that prior to the Merneptah Stele, the people that lived in that area were all called Canaanites. And it wasn't until we get to the Bronze Age collapse, which began in around 1200 BCE, that you start to have a separation within the Canaanite people, a separation between the coastal Canaanite people and the hillside Canaanite people. The coastal Canaanite people remained Canaanites for the most part. Then the hillside Canaanite people started to become your Hebrews, your Israelites, your Amorites, your Ammonites, your Hittites, your Jebusites, your Pebusites, started to become these different sects of people because they started living their lives a bit differently, and they started changing how they worshiped Yahweh, because Yahweh was a Canaanite god. Some went to worship Baals, others went to worship Shamash, but they started, and the Canaanites still maintained that El was the primary god. But they started changing their stories based on El, Baal, Mot, Yahweh, Shamash, and all the other gods in the pantheon. And since they started changing that, they started separating themselves and calling themselves different names. So African DNA can be found in all those people simply because they were controlled by African people for hundreds of years. So therefore, it does not validate your Moses story. It does not validate your Exodus. All it is that once the Phoenicians won the battles against the Egyptians and that area became free and the Bronze Age collapse happened and people moved away from the coastal areas and into the hillside, now they started to compete with their stories to legitimize their nation as the primary nation by giving themselves antiquity that they truly just did not have. And I'm not even going to really get into the fact that you had other people leave Egypt after Akhenaten was dethroned and came into the Sinai Peninsula and up through Africa. I mean, up through the Levant. Not even to mention that that entire Mediterranean area that people traded from as low as East Africa to Somalia, Ethiopia, all the way up into the Levant. And so there would have been many trade routes. There were many trade routes of people interchanging trade, ideas, religion, as well as genetics. So the more provable point is the history and the archaeology, not the made up story that's in your Bible. So y'all have a great day. And remember always, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibration.